There was a figure standing at the edge of the dark that looked exactly like someone it could not have been, and it was already looking back. 3 disturbing deep woods horror stories. Story 1. This all started a few years ago when I was out rock climbing in the Boston Mountains, which is a sub-range of the Ozarks in Arkansas. Before I get into it, I should mention a couple of things. I have pretty shaky mental health, and I deal with a fair amount of paranoia. I also spend a lot of time outdoors, hiking, kayaking, camping, rock climbing. I was an Eagle Scout, and I'm genuinely comfortable out in the woods. The only time I'd ever been really scared out there was when my little brother and I ran into a bear in a box canyon. I was out there with my dad that day. He's getting a little older, so what usually happens is we'll go do something together. He'll get tired, and then head back while I find something else to do on my own. On the drive down to the climbing area, I was on a gravel road with some big washouts running through it, and a sharp curve. At that curve, someone had stacked a few big rock cairns and put reflectors into them. Looking back, maybe they just didn't want people to drive off the edge. But in Arkansas, there are a lot of unofficial trails, sometimes marked by nothing more than cairns or reflector tape, and they can lead to some really beautiful waterfalls and canyons. We finished climbing, and I asked my dad if he wanted to check out the spot on the way back. He said he was too tired and had a 3-hour drive ahead of him and didn't want it to get dark. Totally fair. So we packed up, he headed out, and I drove back over to where I'd seen the markers. There was a pull-off right there, which made it look even more like an unofficial trailhead. I parked and got my stuff together. I usually pack like I'm planning to get lost. Bag, camelback, waterproof matches, first aid kit, compass. I also usually carry a firearm when I hike alone, just in case I run into trouble deep in the woods. I pulled up a mapping app called OnX Backcountry to confirm I'd be on Forest Service land and not wandering onto someone's private property. I could see a creek running down some elevation change and an old unnamed road that used to head out that direction from lower on the ridge. I figured they built the road out there for a reason, and with the creek and the elevation drop, I was guessing there might be a waterfall. I started down a small hill into a pine forest, and it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that there was no trail here, not even a rough unofficial one. I hiked until I hit the old road. It wasn't really a road anymore, more like an ATV trail that had been abandoned a long time ago. Small trees had grown up through the middle of it, and there were downed logs across it that looked like they'd been there for years. The map showed it dead-ending about a mile up, so I started walking toward the end. That's when the paranoia started creeping in. I've read too many scary stories. I started thinking about why those markers were there, why the road existed, whether people held cult meetings out in this creepy pine forest, whether someone was back here watching me hike. I pulled out my pocket knife and carried it in my hand, which usually helps settle the fear because at least I feel like I could defend myself. I got to the end of the road and there was nothing. It just kind of stopped. That happens sometimes, but it was still a nice day and I like being in the woods, so I wasn't upset about it. I also realized nature was calling in a different kind of way, so I dropped off the side of the road down a big hill toward the creek and took care of that. There's no waterfall down there, by the way, just a creek that cascades a little over some rocks. Afterward, I looked at the map and noticed there was another high elevation point on the opposite side of the road. I thought maybe I'd go check it out and scope potential rock climbing spots for future trips. So I bushwhacked through the pines and these knee-high shrubs and ivy covering the ground. When I got there, it was nothing impressive, just a small rock outcropping with nothing really worth climbing. The whole walk was turning into a bust, and I decided it was time to head out. I started walking back and got that creeping feeling again, like something was watching me. I reached for my knife out of habit. It wasn't there. I thought maybe I'd put it in my bag, but then I remembered. I'd set it down on the ground when I was doing my business on the hill. It's not a fancy knife, just a black Gerber. But my dad bought it for me when I was about 14, and I'd had it for 18 years at that point. I couldn't just leave it. I bushwhacked back to the old road and tried to figure out where I'd dropped off. I remembered doing my business near a big ash tree on the hillside. I spotted what I thought was it, dropped off the road again, walked over to the tree. The knife wasn't there. The slope between the creek and the road was about 600 feet of downhill with several large trees scattered among the pines. I kept telling myself it must be the next tree over, and the next one after that, hiking backward along the hill from tree to tree until I reached a point on the map where I knew I'd gone too far. So I went back up to the road and did the whole loop again, and again. Hike the road up about a quarter mile, drop off the side, search around the big trees, hike back. It was the middle of the day and I could feel myself getting hot even though I was drinking a lot of water. I also kept having this feeling that something wanted me to stay out there. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the best way I can describe it. I started getting panicked and frustrated and felt like I was losing my mind a little. I'd done the loop maybe 7 times. I'd searched every large tree on that hill. After a few more loops, I started rushing and being careless, tripping on loose rocks, getting scraped up by briars. I looked down at one point and noticed blood trickling down my leg to my ankle. I must have gotten badly snagged and not even felt it. Every single time I thought about quitting, I told myself one more loop, just one more. But I kept doing it over and over. I wasn't lost. I could hike the road back any time, go up the hill I came down originally, and find my car. My breadcrumb trail on my watch was working and Onyx functions without cell service, so I knew exactly where I was. But I could not bring myself to leave the woods. I felt obsessed with finding that knife, and the whole time I kept feeling like something was watching me and wanted me to keep doing this, keep going in circles, until I tired out. And I was tiring out. I was hot. I was bleeding. I'd been hiking up and down hills for hours. I genuinely wanted to go home. My wife and I joke sometimes about fey gates and fairies when we hike together, and I kept thinking this would be such a perfect fairy trap. Take the knife, trick me into going in circles until I exhaust myself, and it gets dark and I get actually lost. The sun started going down. I forced myself to think about my wife never seeing me again, my parents not knowing what happened to me, my dogs not understanding why I never came home. And then I thought about what might be out there with me after dark. Whether I'd eventually just lie down on the leaves in the fading light and hear something wading through the packed pines toward me, smelling the fear and blood. I felt myself spiraling, but I focused hard on the consequences of staying. I broke my mind away from the knife, hiked back down the road, went up the hill, and started toward my car. Even then, that little voice kept going. You don't want to lose it, do you? What if your dad is hurt that you lost his knife? Maybe just a little longer. I kept walking. I made it back to the car, sat down in the seat, and just sat there for a minute. How long had I been out there hiking in literal circles? I felt physically and mentally wrecked, like I'd been in a daze the whole time. I looked around and it was getting pretty dark. I could have easily gotten stuck out there if I'd stayed even a little longer. I ran through it all in my head and wondered if it was just heat exhaustion. But I'm an ER nurse. I know what heat exhaustion feels like, and this felt different. I felt like I'd been hunted. I also noticed I could smell myself, and it wasn't sweat. It smelled like fear. Right around then, I got a bar of service and saw a missed call from my dad asking if I'd made it home okay. I called him back and told him I'd just gotten out of the woods. He paused for a long moment. Then he said very slowly, "What? You've been out there all this time?" "I've been home for hours." He told me it had been 6 hours since he left the trailhead. 6 hours. An area I could have covered in about an hour total. And I'd been out there for 6 hours going in circles. I got really scared after that. I felt like something was still out there and had just barely missed keeping me in the dark with it. I've been out hiking and camping in the Ozarks and Boston Mountains a few more times since then, and I've gotten turned around in some other odd little ways and felt like I wasn't alone. but that day was the first time it happened, and by far the worst. Story 2. This happened almost a year ago now, and I still think about it more than I'd like to admit. I was living in an old house surrounded by trees, and the layout of the property was kind of unusual. To get to the house, you had to walk down a long hill from the road, so the whole place sat kind of low and tucked away, with woods wrapping around most of it. My dad had a shop behind the house that he used to work out of, just a small outbuilding, and beyond that was just trees and dark. It was close to 4 in the morning. My best friend at the time and I had snuck out earlier that night the way teenagers do, not for any particular reason, just because we could and because the night felt like ours. But now we were making our way back down the hill toward the house, trying to be quiet, trying not to wake anyone up. The kind of careful, slow walking where you're hyper-aware of every twig under your foot. We were almost to the bottom of the hill when my friend suddenly stopped, just froze. She reached out and tried to stop me too, grabbing at my arm without saying a word. I looked at her face and she looked pale, or at least as pale as you could look at 4 in the morning with only ambient light. My first thought was that we'd been caught, that my dad was standing out there watching us, and my stomach dropped because of that. So I looked down toward the back of the house, toward where my dad's shop was, and I saw something. I don't fully know how to describe it, except that it had my dad's outline, not him. Not exactly. It was more like a shadow that held the shape of him. His height, his build, the way he stood, but it wasn't solid, and even as I stared at it, I knew it wasn't him. I don't know how I knew, I just did. It was wrong in a way that's hard to put into words. I couldn't look away from it. I just stood there watching it while it slowly faded, just kind of dissolved into nothing, like smoke clearing. The whole time I was watching it, I felt completely locked in place. Not out of choice, but more like my body forgot what it was supposed to do. My friend was still beside me, and neither of us made a sound. Then we heard footsteps, coming from the woods, moving toward us. Not rushing, not stomping, just steady footsteps in the dark getting closer. That's when whatever trance I was in broke. I grabbed my friend's hand, and we just ran. I didn't care about the cameras my dad had set up around the property. I didn't care about being caught. I just needed to get inside. We went around to the back of the house because there was a door back there closest to my room. My friend hit the steps wrong and went down. Full on fell like something out of a horror movie, and her frozen drink from the gas station hit the ground, and she just yelled "fuck it" and scrambled back up, and then we were through the door and I was turning the lock behind us. We got into my room and closed the door as quietly as we could and just sat there for a second, catching our breath. Then we started talking, both of us whispering, going over what had just happened. I needed to know what she had seen. I asked her to tell me exactly. She told me she hadn't been looking toward the shop at all. She'd been looking toward the front porch, and she said she saw my sister's shadow standing there. We both started crying when we put that together. She hadn't seen my dad. I hadn't seen my sister. But we had both seen the same kind of thing at the same moment, and whatever it was had shown each of us a different person. We looked up spiritual protection stuff online, just trying to feel like we were doing something, and one of the suggestions was to put a line of salt across your doorway. I actually did it. I poured a line of salt in front of my bedroom door, and we stayed up until it got light outside. The next night we were at her place, and we were still going over it because neither of us could let it go. We wanted to test whether we'd actually seen the same thing, so we decided to draw it at the same time without looking at each other's paper. When we held them up, they matched. The shape, the way it stood, even the way it disappeared. We had both drawn a second image almost like a frame of animation, showing it fading out the same way. Looking at those two drawings side by side was one of the more unsettling things I've ever seen. We were sitting there trying to figure out why she saw my sister and I saw my dad, and I just randomly said out loud, "What if it was a mimic?" And my phone started reading out loud what a mimic was. Just started reciting a definition. I had never set up Siri, never used it, didn't even know if it was enabled on my phone. We both just stared at it. I moved away from that house about 7 months ago. I had never felt like I was in danger inside the house itself, but outside after dark always felt off to me, like something was out there and I was always aware of it even when nothing was happening. My ex-boyfriend backed that up without even knowing the full story. One night he came to pick me up while I was still inside packing a bag. When I came out to his truck, he looked shaken. He said he had watched someone run past the front of his truck while he was waiting, and it looked exactly like me. He said we needed to leave immediately, and he was serious about it. He hadn't heard anything about the shadow or the mimic or any of it. He just saw something that looked like me outside when I was still in the house, and it scared him badly enough that he didn't want to be there another second. I moved not long after that. I still think about those drawings and how perfectly they lined up. Story 3. This happened back when I was around 11 or 12 years old, living on a reservation in rural Canada. We had moved to a more isolated part of the community when I was 10, into a small cabin that sat pretty far back from the main road. It was the kind of place where your nearest neighbor wasn't exactly close, where the tree line was just right outside your window, and where quiet wasn't just quiet, it was total. I'd been living there about a year and a half when things started getting strange. Around September 2011, we got hit with a massive flood. There was a dam situation with the river, and because the town was built in kind of a U shape, when the water changed course, it came rushing straight into the middle of that U. It tore through everything, roads, properties. The landscape just got rearranged. For us specifically, it wiped out our driveway. The only road we had connecting our cabin to the rest of the town was just gone. After about a month of figuring things out, we ended up finding an old dirt road that had been dug out at some point, probably a long time ago. And the flood had actually cleared some of the overgrowth and debris that had been blocking it. So we started working on it, clearing the rest by hand so we could actually use it to get in and out. It became our new way in and out of the cabin. The whole time we were out there clearing that road, every one of us kept getting the same feeling, like something was watching from the trees. We never talked about it much, I think because nobody wanted to make a big thing out of it. But I remember noticing it every single time we went out there. You'd be working and then just stop and look up at the tree line for no real reason. Nothing was ever there that you could see, but the feeling didn't go away. After a few months, things in town had mostly normalized again. Life went back to whatever passed for routine out there. And being a kid who basically grew up surrounded by forest, I spent a lot of my time just wandering around outside. I genuinely loved it. I knew the trails, I knew the trees. I felt comfortable out there in a way a lot of kids probably wouldn't. So one day I decided to take a walk down that dirt road. Not for any particular reason, just exploring. And that's when I started paying closer attention to something I'd noticed before, but never really thought much about. There was a white bus parked off to the side of the road. Not a full-size school bus, more like a short bus. It was tucked back against the trees, kind of half hidden by brush. We had seen it before and just left it alone because it seemed abandoned and it would have been expensive to tow out. I'd also seen other random vehicles in the woods before, deep in places they had no business being, so it didn't exactly shock me. But that day, for whatever reason, I decided to actually go look at it. I was 11. Curiosity was pretty much my default setting. I got up to the door and worked at it for a bit and managed to pry it open. There was no bad smell, which I remember thinking was kind of surprising for something that looked so old and unused. The inside was strange though. The walls were wooden, like actual wood paneling on the interior, which felt really out of place against that bright white exterior. The bus had clearly been there for a long time. And it was filled with big black garbage bags, just stacked in there, all of them tied up. I stood there for a second looking at them, and then, because I was a kid and that's what kids do, I opened one. Shoes. It was full of shoes. I opened another bag. More shoes. All of them women's shoes, and they covered a weird range. Some looked old, like genuinely old, vintage from eras I didn't recognize. Some looked like they could have been bought recently. Different styles, different sizes, but every single one I picked up was a left shoe. A short, chunky heel, and always the left foot. Not a single matching right shoe anywhere. I looked up from the bags, and that's when I noticed the walls, covering the wooden paneling, just completely covering it, were photographs. Pictures of women. Some looked like they were from the Victorian era, old printed photographs. Some were magazine cutouts of celebrities I recognized from TV. Just women, floor to ceiling, covering every bit of wall space in that bus. I put the shoe down. That feeling of being watched that I'd had while clearing the road months ago came back immediately and hard. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I just knew I needed to get out. I stepped toward the door and started climbing out of the bus. And that's when I heard it. From somewhere off to my left, maybe not that close but not far enough. A voice. A man's voice. Just, hey, drawn out, like he was trying to sound casual. I did not think. I ran. I went right because right was the direction back home, and I ran faster than I think I have ever run in my life. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran until I got home. The thing that still gets me when I think about it is that none of us even knew that bus was there until after the flood. The flood changed the road. We found the old path, and clearing that path is what brought us close enough to even discover it. It had been sitting out there hidden before that, and who knows how long. Looking back on it now, I really think I stumbled onto something that belonged to someone very dangerous. Left shoes, only left shoes, from different time periods, stuffed into garbage bags in a hidden bus in the middle of the woods on an isolated reservation road. I don't know what to make of it other than what it looks like, and I try not to think too hard about who was standing in those trees watching me walk back out.